Hello and welcome to another edition of Enta Asks. Joining me today is Sebastiaan Lampo, founder of Blocktivity. For 15 years, Sebastiaan has helped his clients in physical asset management. He is very interested in the complex dynamics between multiple disciplines to achieve this challenging goal. Welcome, Sebastiaan.
Thanks, Adam. Thank you, Kate.
Welcome, Sebastiaan. We're so glad to have you. Before we jump into our question with you, just tell us a little bit about how Blocktivity came about.
So it's a long story in duration. Really, I started off my career with big consultancy firm KPMG, and really went from doing low-level work in asset management, like with very detailed data analysis, slowly working my way up to get to work with very big clients and getting to work with executive director, assistant deputy managers, assistant deputy ministers. And it was really that transition built me the confidence, gave me the confidence to really strike out on my own. So after over a decade at KPMG, I wanted to build something that is more agile, that has less procedures, and where I feel more connected to the client. So that's where I now work as an independent consultancy firm. I partner with others, but that is really where we came from.
Excellent. That's great.
Okay, fantastic. I love a good origin story. So today we want to talk about asset management and how it can reduce costs. And I think that is especially relevant as people deal with the fallout of COVID. So, first, for our audience, what is asset management? And then second, how can we use it to save costs?
So to the first part, Adam, asset management, and I'll add one word to it, physical asset management, because there's a lot of asset management in banking, which is not what I do. I look at physical assets, like anytime you have a machine, a building, a bridge, a road, that type of assets. There is the field of asset management is really around maximizing the value you get out of those assets. And that's still very theoretical, but what does that mean? If you're government, it means delivering those services that you get from the assets as effectively as possible, as cheaply as possible. If you're a business, you want to maximize the efficiency, reduce your costs, produce as much as possible, increase your profit margin using your assets. Assets in themselves don't do anything, so you only use them to deliver a service, produce goods. That's where your assets come from. So you always have to look at how well do they achieve that objective for you.
So then introduce us to how we're going to save costs by doing this. Like what can we do?
So there's really, I think for this discussion, there's like three areas I want to focus on to break down this field a little. When you're looking at your assets, there's typically a whole number of people involved. You have accounting looks at it one way. You typically have people with budget over capital investment. You have the maintenance people that maintain your assets and keep them in good shape. Then you have users of assets in a production environment. That's your production line, your production people. All of those look at those assets in a different way. So what we're going to do is look at three distinct areas. The first one is, how do you improve your capital investment decisions? The second would be minimizing your life cycle costs once you have an asset. And then third is really, how do you improve your operational efficiency using asset management? So if I just launch right into it, the first one around improving your capital investment decisions. As soon as you have more than one person responsible for that budget, you need coordination. Because of those different viewpoints, you would typically not have all the information to make the decision perfectly if you just have one angle. So what we're doing is making sure that the right people get together in the room and they make their decisions together. So what does that look like? One is having a coherent view of all your needs. So it's not just around, oh, we need this little widget producing machine, we need this little improvement in our loading dock, or we need a new library here, or we need this little improvement. It's around what do we need in the big picture, and what is the optimal solution, knowing all those different needs. It might be, and I've had one client that simply tweaking little things is not the right answer. What they needed was to completely have a new facility because their existing facility was too cramped and had a massive impact on how they worked and produced their widgets.
So I guess it's really important to have that process rigor, right? To know from the start what is it you're trying to achieve. Otherwise, you could go down rabbit holes in all sorts of different directions, like your client you mentioned, right?
Absolutely. It's about having that process you mentioned, making sure that you collect all those different needs from within the organization, from the various levels, because it's the people that use your assets day to day that know them best. So you need to have that process for extracting that information, collecting it, and having a standardized, rigorous look at everything that comes through that pipeline. And because it revolves over time, you need to do that on a repetitive cycle and have that continuous view at your investment decisions.
And there's so many integrated parts, like it could be something upstream that's really impacting, right? Like I think that's so important, having all the right people, because there's so many integrations and like inputs, just not just the asset itself.
Absolutely, Caitlin. And like you said, it goes both ways. It can come from the top if you're making a new strategic decision, or it can come from the bottom where you're identifying inefficiencies, or you have constantly trouble with one particular machine or one particular building. Like you need both of those. And a great example was a utility client of mine where they were having issues on one particular electricity line, and they're like looking at doing some minor upgrades. Whereas their long-term plan was to really invest in a specific region of the province, which meant that they needed a substantial upgrade, not just a little tweak, but a substantial upgrade over the next 15 years. So by looking at that strategic plan and looking at the small need, they decided, okay, we need that upgrade right now, but in 15 years, we're going to need way more. So does it make sense to do the entire massive investment right up front, take care of the small need that we have immediately, plus enabling our long-term plan? So those are the decisions where they saved over $20 million with that integrated look. So it's not just, that's where capital investments are typically big bucks. So that's where you save a lot of money.
Yeah, totally. So let's talk about how then we minimize life cycle costs.
So an interesting phenomenon I've seen is when you have an asset, people get a maintenance schedule, either through best practice, like their maintenance guys will talk to others. They'll start off with what the manufacturer might recommend, and you go from there. There's very little testing as to whether or not that is the right approach. So when you look at, for example, websites like a Facebook and whatnot, what do? Every single time somebody lands on their website, they do A/B testing. They test different approaches. We typically don't do that in asset management yet. So one client I have started off looking at this because they have over 1,000 of the same assets. Like you need a little bit of scale, or you need a shared data source with other organizations to do this properly. But they can start looking at, is it the right interval to look at this fan every 3 months, which is what the maintenance recommendation was. And they started building a program where they looked at some every 3 months, some every 6 months, every year, or not at all. So you distinct the population, and then you get more data that informs your decision around, do we actually need to go there? And it's not just, it sounds really trivial, but the interesting thing is a lot of maintenance, and some people don't like to hear this, but a lot of maintenance is actually counterproductive. Because
it could be downtime.
For starters, you're often introducing downtime. Second, as soon as you're touching a complex machine, the chances of you introducing a little error during your maintenance is actually non-zero. So I've done a test with a client, and they had 6 elevators in their building. And we looked at, so elevators are a regulated asset. They have to have them looked at every month, or at least on a periodic schedule. The periodic schedule they chose was every month. And for the first 5 days after the regular maintenance, the chance of a failure was higher than in the remaining 20 days. So it was clear that having that maintenance was not free. Like, there is a chance of introducing downtime after the fact and increasing the return calls and the annoyance for the users, right? So
that's really, it's amazing if you look at it systematically and just look at the data, how it can seem counterintuitive, right? I might say, well, I should maintain the elevators more if I want them to fail less, but in fact, the reverse is true. It's interesting.
It's about a balance. Like, clearly you don't want to ever look at an elevator, because that would also carry a high risk. Some assets you don't want to touch ever. Like, we have clients in the utility industry again, with gas, you have a lot of valves, so you can shut off certain areas of your network. So they have preventative maintenance routines around going to check that the valve still works, so that you can shut it off if there's a leak and whatnot. Here's the interesting thing. You can't actually close that valve entirely, because if you close it entirely, then you're putting customers out of gas. So what they test is they turn it down to about 75%, and they say, yep, the valve is good, and they turn it back open. But it's really the last 25% that is critical. So you're not actually gaining anything by doing that maintenance, yet they've been doing it for years and years and years.
Interesting. So then I guess that really begs that question of operational efficiencies, like looking at, does that make sense, right? Because there's a cost to everything, right?
Absolutely. And one aspect here that I find is often overlooked, and that is particularly relevant to small business owners as well, is looking at your critical production line, your critical assets, and what would be the impact of having unplanned downtime on one of your production machines. And break it down a little from there, not just say, oh, it's this machine, but within a machine, typically there's various components that allow it to do its job properly. So break it down and look at what are the critical components within that enable that machine to really function. And are any of those hard to source? And if so, you might want to have some of these parts on site, or at least have a guarantee of your distributor that they can get them to you within 24 hours. Because otherwise, your production schedule is going to be interrupted, and it can be, some parts are so hard to get, it can be multiple weeks. At that point, you're looking at a business continuity impact, because you might be disappointing some customers, etc. So one client that looked after one building, they had a look at their HVAC systems, and they discovered that one pump within that system, of which they had 5. So it's not a big number of assets. They don't have a lot of them. But they decided that of this asset of which they had 5, the lead time to get a new one, if it failed, was 3 weeks, which they determined to be unacceptable. And they're like, okay, so if we look at the big picture, eventually one of these will fail. So what we're doing is we're shifting a capital outlay of replacing that pump from maybe 15 years down the road. We're going to spend that money right now, have the spare pump on site, which has a small maintenance cost, but almost negligible, and have that assurance that when one of our 5 fails, we can immediately replace it, and our downtime is going to be less than 1 day. So you're essentially not increasing your cost a lot, you're just shifting it forward. And that is the type of integrated thinking that really it characterizes asset management.
And it's not just like the downtime, right? There's client impact, there's reputation, there could be safety risks that come along with that. There's so much in addition to just, oh, downtime and dollars, that is kind of like the intangibles of it all.
Absolutely. And your question points at one of the hardest things to do, Caitlin, is how do you prioritize across all those dimensions? And that really goes to one of my passions in this field, and it's risk analysis. Essentially, you need a framework in which all of those factors, you have a methodology for weighing them against each other. How important is our reputation? How important is our customer? How important is simply having the machine operational? And building that into one framework that incorporates all those different views from the different people in your organization and your stakeholders. And that allows you to make a streamlined decision that takes all those factors into account. It's a really cool field.
That's great. So we really appreciate having you on and talking to us about asset management. And we know that this is a long-term task for people to do effective asset management in their companies. But now's a good time to start, like with the COVID happening. And people looking at costs, now's a good time to start. I mean, maybe 5 years ago would have been a better time to start, but now's the second best time. Like planting a tree. So,
Yeah.
so what they really need to do, and we'll sum up here, is your top 3 things. They need to improve their capital investment. They need to minimize life cycle costs, and then improve operational efficiencies.
Spot on.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much, Sebastiaan. We appreciate having you on and talking to us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sebastiaan.
Bye.